Today we have two speakers. Our first speaker will be Matt Aikens, and we also have Tina Coleman. I'll just do a brief bio for you on Matt. He's going to present on heifer growth and nutrition. And Matt Aikens is an assistant scientist and dairy research specialist with a focus on dairy heifer nutrition and management. He obtained his BS from UW-Platteville, his MS from the University of Arkansas, and his PhD from UW-Madison. He works at the Marshfield Ag Research Station and conducts heifer research studies to evaluate nutrition and forage feeding strategies to control heifer growth and cost of production. So on behalf of our team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And with that, Matt, could you start out with your calf and heifer development presentation?
Thanks, Matt. All right, glad to be here today. So this presentation will focus mostly on growth and development. So looking at the different growth measurements, and then nutritional, what nutritional programs should we be using to meet those targets. Right, so just a little review on the management goals for heifers. So ideally we're looking to get heifers to come into first lactation between about 22 and 24 months. That's just based on data that'll optimize the first lactation milk production. And also you don't want to be calving in later than that because that'll be additional days on feed and then additional costs. And more people are starting to calve in even earlier, especially that 22, 23 month age range. And that's definitely doable, but you do need to pay attention fairly closely to the growth and of these animals, making sure they're on target and meeting the growth targets as they at breeding and at calving to make sure you're hitting those. The other goals obviously are controlling cost. Again, these are not, we're not getting any kind of income from these animals at this point. So we want to try to control these costs as best we can, and controlling days on feed is one major way of doing that. And then minimizing nutrient excretion, so feeding the correct protein contents, correct mineral, especially phosphorus, trying to reduce the phosphorus excretion from these animals is definitely a goal. And then lastly, we want to allow for genetic potential. So we don't want to manage these animals in ways that would possibly reduce production later on. So we want to make sure that they're coming into lactation at a good body condition score. They're not overly conditioned. And also we want to make sure they're at the right body size at first lactation so they can optimize that production. And from some recent data from Wisconsin, this is on-farm data from a survey that was done in 2013, and then we re-updated it in 2015 with more recent feed costs. From that data, the total cost from birth to calving for heifers ranged from about $1,800 to $2,200, so about an average of about $2,000 per animal to raise from birth to calving. But of that $2,000, about half of it was feed costs. And a lot of that comes in post-breeding. So as you go along, that animal consumes more feed, those feed costs generally go up. So we want to try to, again, control those days on feed and make sure we're getting them bred at the correct time to try to get those animals to come into lactation about 22 to 23 months ideally. So optimal heifer growth, we really need to maintain an optimal growth throughout the heifer's life. So from the weaning to breeding stage, this will determine when that animal can be starting to go into the breeding program. Ideally, we're going to try to get them into the breeding pens at about 12 to 13 months of age and starting to breed them at that 13-month mark to hit that 22-month age at first calving. So if we don't hit those growth rates between weaning and breeding, we're going to be setting that animal up to be smaller at breeding, and that's not going to set us up for a good situation later on. And then from breeding to calving, we kind of have to switch our mindset We don't want to be feeding these animals to achieve too high of growth, because these animals can put on fat very quickly. They're approaching their mature body size at this point, so they're going to be putting on more fat than muscle. So we want to really control the energy intake to avoid overconditioning of these animals. And lastly, the growth rate of these animals will depend directly on the herd's mature cow weight. So that's something we have to keep in mind, is what's the actual mature weight of the animals in your herd. And you need to use that as a kind of a basis of how you determine what those growth rates should be from weaning up to calving. Something else to note is reproduction becomes really important for heifer management. If we have less ideal reproductive programs, we're going to cause animals to become, they're not going to be coming into lactation at that 22 to 24 month range. And then we're going to end up with animals that are likely going to be overconditioned and coming into lactation because they've been on feed for a longer period of time. So we really need to have an excellent reproductive program set up to make this system work. So I have one poll question. So just how often do you measure heifers on your farm or your client's farm? So do you not take any measurements during any times? Do you do it in just the pre-weaning phase? Do you only take them before breeding? Or do you have a combination of calf or pre-weaning and pre-breeding? Or do you do a pretty complex system of pre-weaning, pre-breeding, and then a calving weight? Okay, so if we look at the results here, it looks fairly of what I would expect. So about 40% currently not doing measurements. Something I would guess I would expect. Sometimes it can be difficult to implement that on a farm. About a third of you are taking measurements at the pre-weaning phase, really emphasizing those calf measurements. And then one of you have done pre-breeding weights to look at probably the reproduction and making sure the ideal weight at breeding. And then a few of you are doing a bit more comprehensive management program, it looks like. So looks like we got a good diversity. Definitely some room for maybe some greater implementation of calf weights. So hopefully you can get some additional information to help with that. Next, we're going to move on to how do we, what's the ideal growth pattern for heifers? How do we measure these animals and to be able to use the data? So how the dairy NRC, or the nutritional requirements program, works is everything's based on growth of heifers as a function of mature body weight. And that the reason we use that is because, as you can see from this graph, it's a fairly linear function from birth up to calving. If we we calculate the percent of mature body weight, so we take the current weight of an animal divided by the estimated mature body weight to get this percent of mature weight, and then plot it against the age, you can see that this is going to be fairly close to this linear line. As you can see from this is data from the Marshfield research station. And we can use that to then estimate, if we can estimate the mature body weight of our herd, we can then actually build this line to then use it as a guide. So in this example, at 13 months, that's going to be our breeding age. These animals, our goal is to have them about 55% of mature body weight. So we want these animals to be fairly close to this target at breeding. That's probably the main target that we'll be discussing. If they're far from that target, especially under it, that's going to tell you that those animals did not grow properly and were not meeting the growth targets. Using growth as a function of mature body weight is really important because it puts everything relative to what the herd is, instead of just looking at standard guidelines that are provided. So as far as growth benchmarks, as a percent of mature body weight, so typically animals reach puberty about 45% of mature body weight. They'll start to show signs of estrus. As far as the breeding time or breeding weight, it's going to be about 55% mature body weights, where we're going to be targeting to start breeding. And we want to be getting them pregnant by the latest by about 60% of mature body weight. As far as the first lactation calving weights, pre-calving, if you take your weights before calving within a week of before calving, they should be about 90 to 94% of mature body weight. If you take those post-calving within a week, they should be, again, obviously they lose the calf weight and some of the birth, some of the placental weight. It's going to be about 80 to 84% of mature body weight. So those are really targets that we want to be looking at when we're evaluating our herds. For actually getting the mature weight of the cows in your herd, you need to be looking at any cows that are greater than third lactation, and you're going to be wanting to look at during the mid-lactation when they're fairly stable body weights. You could also use direct post-calving weights, but you don't want to be taking weights from like past about a week to 2 weeks after calving, because they're going to start losing body weight fairly quickly, and that their weight can be highly variable after that. So either you can take them directly after calving or sometime in mid-lactation between 100 to 200 days in milk. There's a nice tool that's on the UW Heifer extension website, this universal heifer growth chart. And what you can do is, if you know your mature body weight of your herd, you simply enter it in this box. So in this case, for the UW herd, we have an estimated mature body weight of about 1,650 pounds. So you enter it in there, and then these target body weights will then be automatically calculated for you to then compare your body weights to. It also gives you some target ranges here for the breeding ages from 13 to 15 months, what those body weights should be based on that mature body weight provided. On the right side, you can see those are just some examples. But again, you should be taking measurements, and you can either use a weight tape or a scale to get at these estimates. And you probably want to be doing about 10% of your herd to be able to get a decent average or estimate for your herd. So what do we do so how we take that data? So we've got the mature body weight and the targets. We then use those to figure out what do we need for growth or average daily gain for these animals. So if our goal is to start breeding at 13 months, and we want a body weight at breeding of 55% of mature weight. So the goal is at breeding, we want to have the animal be about 900 pounds at that 13-month age. And if we know the mature body weight is going to be around 1,650 pounds, we can then figure out by simple math what their average daily gain needs to be between weaning and breeding. Also note that the height at breeding, there's also some nice guidelines for that. So at about a year of age, they should be hitting about 86, 88% of mature height. So in this case, I had about 58 inches on average of mature height. For a height at breeding would be about 50 inches. It's fairly standard across industry, starting of a height to start breeding at.
Say, Matt, we do have a question,
Yeah.
fit in right now. Person mentions that they see that there's heifers freshening in at 19 months. What are the negatives of, are there negatives of that?
Yeah, I guess I don't have data on that early of animals at 19 months. That's pushing it as far as an early age at calving. I can't say whether that's negative or what implications that might be. I just thinking that you might have some issues with possible calving issues with if you're not getting those animals skeletal frames large enough to be able to, you might have some calving issues if those animals are too small. Calving at that young of an age, to put on enough weight and frame, you'd have to be having very high rates of gain throughout the heifer raising period to be able to hit that a target at 19 months of age to hit some of those targets.
They're typically going to have lower first lactation yields, are they not?
Yeah, pretty likely to have lower first lactation yields. A lot of that again depends on the body size at calving, but at 19 months, that you really have to push animals growth-wise to be able to hit that. You're cutting off about 2 to 3 months of time off that animal's growth curve to be able to hit that.
And as long as we're doing questions, we have another one.
Yeah.
When you're talking about heights, are you talking hip height or wither height?
Those are hip heights. I generally don't use wither heights, but wither heights for experimental reason are really hard to do in a shoot. Just if you ever try it, they can be very difficult to get the animal to stand in a similar position every time you take those wither heights. Compared to a hip height, it's not as affected by the position of the animal of the front feet. So I use hip heights instead of wither heights. So, good question. So now if we move on, we want to figure out the total, the gain that these animals would need to have per day. So if we have the breeding weight of 900 pounds, weaning weight of 180 pounds, that animal needs to gain 720 pounds between weaning and breeding. So then we figure out how many days that animal has to reach the gain. So she's 56 days at weaning, 395 days at breeding. She's got 339 days to reach that target. So we just do some simple math. She's going to need to gain about 2.1 pounds per day to reach those targets. Moving on, if we look past breeding, we do a similar calculation. So we have a body weight prior to calving, 92% of mature weight. So that's going to make our goal of about 1,520 pounds prior to calving. Total gain needed, again, subtract 900 pounds from for the breeding weight from that. So she has to gain again 620 pounds approximately between breeding and calving. She got about 290 days to gain that weight. So again, right around 2.1 pounds of growth is what she's going to need per day to reach that target at calving. So if we have these growth targets, we can then start to formulate what growth do we need to be per day do we need to have to hit those. And then you work with your nutritionist to then balance diets appropriately to hit those. So as far as times of measurement, there's a few times that I think are fairly important. The birth weight's probably one of the most important ones. That really sets the stage for how we calculate our measurements moving forward. Without that, it makes it really difficult, especially a pre-weaning period, to really evaluate that. The second one would be the weaning weight, and that, again, that's going to be used for evaluating your pre-weaning nutrition and health programs. Next would be, this is probably the one that you may need or may not need, but it can be useful at that 4 to 6 month time frame. Is a good time to take a weight, and it really evaluates how well that heifer transitioned to solid feeds. Whether there's some delay or slowing in growth, that might tell you that maybe we need to think about adjusting that post-weaning nutrition program a bit to really improve that growth. This 12 to 13 month old weight is probably one of the most critical, because that's really going to tell you, is that animal at the optimal size for breeding? Is she hitting that target of 55% of mature weight to trigger you to say, we can breed this animal? And then the pre or post calving weights, again, that's going to tell you, is that animal at the optimal size for lactation? Again, you can start managing. If you're starting to see the animals either coming over conditioned or too thin or too small, you can then start to adjust that post-breeding nutrition program to optimize the growth during that phase. Implementation's often the difficult part. Facilities are often not really set up to do measurements. One thing that makes it pretty nice is headlocks. Having headlocks makes it nice to be able to do taping. You can go down the line and do weight tapes fairly effectively using a headlock. Also, if you do any vaccinations, you put animals through a chute, that's another really good time to take measurements. I will tell you that a chute with some kind of electronic scale makes it very efficient to do measurements. We can put animals through the scale very quickly. We run groups of 8 through, and we can measure those animals within probably 2 or 3 minutes when we have 2 people working the chute. So just getting them on, getting them off fairly quickly to get weights. But again, if you don't have a scale, weight tape is better than not having any data at all to evaluate. So this is an example of a chute and drover's lane system we have at the Marshfield Research Station. Very nice to have this drover's lane behind the pens that we can very effectively move animals out of pens to do treatments, do our body measurements, pretty much any kind of work we want to do with the animals. Very efficient type of system. We can have one person very effectively move animals around in this. So next we're going to go through how the UW does their heifer growth management. So we have animals actually at the Arlington Dairy Facility and at Marshfield Research Station. So the calves are all down at the Arlington station. So we collect birth weights, weaning weights, and shipping weights on those, and they're all inputted into just a simple Excel file that the management crew uses to evaluate those animals. And then they're brought up to Marshfield about 3 months of age. We have 2 different confinement barns that we run, both with drover's lanes with gates and a chute in each barn. At Marshfield, we do weights at least at 6 months and at 12 months, and those are both associated with vaccinations. And then we do another weight prior to calving. So before they get shipped down to Arlington, we'll grab a weight on those as well. The one thing that we do really religiously in this system is to grab at 12 months of age, everything will get weighed to determine if they're large enough for breeding starting at 13 months. So our cutoff is about 825 pounds. If they don't hit that, they might delay that breeding a few weeks to ensure that they're at the right body size for breeding. So we're going to go through a little bit of data here. This is an example of the Excel spreadsheet that we maintain, or that the Arlington facility maintains. So we have the calf number, the birth date, the weights, the date when they're moved into the super hutch, or the weaning date, and then that is the weight associated with that, and then the day and the weight of the when they're shipped up to Marshfield. The daily gains are then figured out for each of those phases. So what we do with that is we can then track how our animals are doing over time by plotting the averages across time. So these are going all the way back to 2013, and this data set's only up till about the middle of 2018. I need to update this for 2019 and 2020. But you can see the blue bars are the pre-weaning growth, the red bars are the post-weaning. So we're hitting our target of about 1.5 pounds per day on average for the pre-weaning to hit that, to double our birth weight by 56 days. So fairly consistent, right around 1.5 to 1.7 pounds per day on average. Once these animals are weaned, growth definitely increases once they get on that solid feed. Right around 2 to 2.5 pounds per day, typically across these 4 or 5 years of data. But you can see there's quite a bit of variation across this, the data. If we look within these data, it's within one of these bars, I pulled one out from the last set of animals that we had in the last quarter of the data. These are the pre-weaning daily gains from one of those quarters. So you can see fairly uniform actually. So about 40 animals, 40 of the calves range between about 1.5 to 1.75, with a few having higher growth and just a few lower growth. So fairly consistent pre-weaning growth out of these calves. And what we notice when we wean them, we see quite a bit more variation in growth. So from less than 1 pound per day all the way up to probably 2.75 pounds per day variation in growth of these animals. Most of them are between the 1.5 to 2.5 pounds per day, but we have quite a few stragglers here at this tail end here that aren't really adapting well to either the grouping or to adjusting to the solid feed. And that's probably, if you look at your farm or your client's farm, that's probably fairly normal is what you'd see. These animals are going through some stress. They're grouped they go from single hutches up to groups of 4 animals during this time. Plus they're being switched to a different grower, and they're also starting to be fed a bit of hay during this time. So they're going through a couple different changes that they're having to deal with. Next, I'll just show you the overall growth. So this is just a snippet in time from the second half of 2018. And these are all data from the Marshfield station. This Excel spreadsheet is from the Penn State Extension website. Very, very nice Excel document that you can input your data into, and it produces these very nice graphs to track your individual animals. So as you can see from this data, fairly good growth following the estimated curve up through breeding up to that 14 to 16 month age. And then you see a slight lowering of this growth up to calving. And I'll tell you, this spreadsheet's a little bit difficult to use because there's a lot of different calculations or adjustments that you can input that adjusts this line, whether it's your estimated age at calving, whether it's your mature size. These are all estimates that affect this line. So you need to make sure that those are as best as and accurate as you can get to make sure that this line is the correct estimated growth of your herd. Otherwise, you're going to end up, if you estimate too early of a calving age or what you actually are, that's going to move this line over to the left a little bit, and it can make your estimates look off from what your actual herd is. So you need to actually gather this data on calving age and mature body size to really use this information. But you can see it's a slightly lower. These pregnant animals are slightly below the curve here. Some possibilities, the herd is using smaller genetic size sires to moderate the body size a bit in the herd. So that could be one thing to keep in mind. Also, we want to keep in mind, what's the body condition score of these heifers coming to lactation? Are they adequate body condition at calving? Next, we're going to move on to the nutrition side. So these are some basic guidelines for intake, protein, and energy for dairy heifers. So as you can see, the dry matter intake, obviously from a 300-pound animal up to a 1,200-pound animal increases fairly dramatically. From about 9 pounds up to almost 27 pounds of intake. But as this intake goes up, their crude protein needs, the protein requirement generally will go down, or the percent of the diet decreases. So we'll start off at these post-weaned animals, about 17% diet, down to a 15, down to 14, down to 13%. So we can be adjusting these diets accordingly. And this is actually very important, not only cost-wise, but also for nutrient management-wise, to make sure we're not overfeeding protein and nitrogen to the animals. And then if we look at energy probably is even more important than protein, and making sure we have the correct energy concentration of the diet. So if we look at TDN, again, we start off at a higher percentage, and then we decrease it as this animal is able to have greater intakes. But some of these values are probably even a bit high, depending on the management that you have And we'll show some data showing that some of these animals that eat diets that are 63% TDN, they will gain well above what our expectations are, especially in a freestall setting where they're very limited exercise availability. They're restricted as far as what they can do. Some of these animals are not going to require that kind of energy content for the growth we're needing. So first, we're going to go into the post-weaning nutrition a little bit more. Again, these have higher protein and energy needs, especially these 300-pound animals. Definitely going to need some protein and energy supplementation through a concentrate feed. Generally, it's going to be probably 60 to 70% of the diet will be concentrate at this point in time. Oftentimes, it's through a grower concentrate being fed. But as we start to move them into about 600-pound groups, we can start to back off on that grain quite a bit. Adjust that protein down a bit, adjust the energy down, and start to incorporate more and more forages into the diet. So by this point in time, by that 600-pound mark, we can be feeding a fairly high forage diet. Upwards of 70 to 80% of the diet can be forage. The one thing to keep in mind is that forage is going to have to be fairly high quality. We don't want to be feeding these animals lower quality forage because their intakes are still pretty restricted. They're still fairly small animals at this point. We don't want to be feeding really stemmy, high fiber forage to these animals at this time. There's some nice work that was done in Purdue looking at this specific thing and looking at grain to forage ratios in about 300 to 400-pound animals. So they put these animals on either 3 diets. So they're about 4.5 months of age. They put them on either a 40% grain diet, a 60% or 80% grain diet to see how they grow. And you can see that these animals on the lower grain diet just didn't grow very well, about 1.4 pound versus 1.9 versus 2.3. At 6.5 months, they then switched them to a 60-40 diet, a 60% grain diet. And you can see that these animals on the lower grain diet before definitely responded well and increased their growth. These ones that were on the same diet maintained that growth, but those ones on the high grain diet actually had more depressed growth. So these ones on this 60% grain diet did really fairly well. And overall, they were had the lowest cost per gain compared to the other 2 treatments. One thing to keep in mind is that if you do graze, we can definitely graze these pre-breeding heifers. We've been doing this at the Marshfield station for the last about 5 years. So we've done a few studies with this. So this is a study that we did in 2017 and 2018. We put them out there at about 5 to 6 months of age at the start on a fairly high quality pasture mixture. So it included meadow fescue, ryegrass, speciuloleum, and a couple clovers to really build in the protein. You can see that we grazed for about 170 days in 2017 and about 130 days in 2018. The main thing to keep in mind here is that looking at the fiber content and the protein, very high quality, not overly mature forage here, highly digestible, 60% NDF digestibility, 65% TDN. So these animals grew really, really well, about 2 pounds per day across the season. So very well, very high growth on these animals, meeting the targets that we needed them to. And they did not receive any kind of grain supplementation during the entire summer. If you're going to raise these animals on pasture, you really need to have high quality pasture throughout the entire season. Moving on to pregnant heifer nutrition. Okay, these definitely have lower energy and protein needs. As I mentioned before, about 60 to 62% total digestible nutrients. Protein, only 13 to 14% protein. We don't need to be feeding a higher protein diet to these animals to get growth on these heifers. The one thing to keep in mind is overconditioning. We don't want these animals to be gaining a lot of condition coming to lactation, because that's going to likely cause problems in early lactation where they're going to lose body weight fairly quickly due to that fat mobilization. So we really got to be careful if we're going to feed corn silage in any amount. to these animals. If we have a moderate, even high corn silage diet, they'll gain in diets, in studies we've had them gain 2.5 to 3 pounds per day on even a 50% corn silage diet. So there's a couple options to deal with this. We can either use a higher fiber forage source or roughage source to dilute the energy and increase the fiber content of the diet, or we can use limit feeding is another good option. So the reason we can use fiber as a way to control intake is because heifers have a limit of about 1% of their body weight of intake per day. So if we have a 1,000-pound heifer, we're going to estimate she's going to eat about 10 pounds of NDF each day. And we can use that as a way to control intake by feeding a higher fiber diet. So if we feed a 45% fiber diet, we're going to estimate she's going to eat 22 pounds of intake. If we feed a 50% fiber diet, she's only going to eat 20. So we can control our intake using fiber instead of deliberately restricting intake. And you can see this is from data from Pat Hoffman that he built over several years. So that's fairly consistent, this intake restriction across different body weights. And these are generally restricted to high fiber or high forage diets. If you're feeding a fairly high grain diet or high byproduct feed diet, this may not be the case due to the small particle size of that byproduct feed. These were high forage diets. In a recent trial we did with sorghum Sudan grass forage, we looked at this exact topic. So we had diets that were diluted with sorghum Sudan grass or chopped hay. If we look at the NDF content, we had 48% on this control diet that had the hay in it versus 55 for the sorghum Sudan grass. Try to target the protein right around 13 to 14% and the TDN right around 60 to 61%. If we look at the performance data, as you would expect, these animals that were fed the higher fiber diets had lower intakes. So they ate about 4 pounds less feed per day. They all ate almost the exact same amount of fiber though, again, due to the fact that we're restricting these animals based on fiber in the diet. And if we look at daily gain, these animals on the control were gaining well above what we want them to be gaining, about 2.4 pounds a day versus right around 2 to 2.1 pounds per day for the sorghum Sudan grass. Then if you look at the cost per day, we're saving about 20 cents per day, mainly due to the dry matter intake reduction for these diets. Just those 4 pounds of intake saved us about the 20 cents. Next, we'll move on to limit feeding. This has been looked at quite a bit by Penn State and also by Pat Hoffman when he was with UW. Simply, it's just feeding a higher concentrate diet. We're just restricting how much we feed, so we're feeding less of it. So instead of feeding ad libitum, we're feeding typically 80 to 90% of what they would eat if we give them free choice. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to give them the same amount of intake, nutrient intake, to a full fed diet, similar to what we're doing with the higher fiber forage diets. We're trying to match that nutrient intake to those type of diets. And what that does is it controls their intakes, the amount of energy and protein they take in, and also then controls their body weight gain. The cost can be an issue to try to balance that. So using some least cost formulation and byproduct feeds work pretty well for that, to control those costs, because your cost per unit of feed generally be higher because you're feeding more protein or higher energy feeds. So this is just an example from a recent study by Wayne Coleman. So we had a control diet that was 68% energy or TDN, and he fed that either ad libitum or he limit fed that at about 85% of the control. And you can see the control ate about 21 pounds, the limit fed only ate 18 pounds, which then allowed to get that daily gain closer to our targets at about 1.9 to 2 pounds per day. We do not want animals to be gaining 2.4 pounds a day very long, because they will put on a very immense amount of fat very quickly, because all that extra half pound of weight is going to be put on as condition on that animal's back. And if you looked at the body condition on these animals, they were at 4 or above on these control animals. This was a 120-day feeding study. Limit feeding does have some challenges. There is some behavior changes. Obviously, this ad libitum intake is a little exaggerated. This is a picture from Randy Shaver. But yeah, that's a little excessive, but just to push the point home, compared to limit feeding. There are some behavior changes you got to consider, because when you limit feed the animal, they're going to be out of feed. Typically, if we feed at between 8 and 9 in the morning, they're going to be out of feed by 5 p.m. So that's a pretty long period of time that they're going to be without feed. So that can cause the animals to go through some vocalizations. And so you can see this is some data that Pat Hoffman had gathered from his work. So you can see in the first about 4 to 6 weeks, those animals will be more vocal because they're being withheld feed. They are out of feed sooner. So obviously they're adjusting to that. But within about 6 to 7 weeks, their bodies become adjusted. Their digestive tract actually will shrink slightly to adjust. That's one thing you got to consider, is you're going to have some animals bellowing in the barn for a few weeks. The other thing is these animals will be very aggressive. So when you feed them in the morning, they are going to be coming up to the feed bunk, and you need to make sure you have space for all of the animals to eat at one time, so that each animal is not having to fight for a spot, and also making sure that those maybe smaller or younger animals are able to access the same feed as the older, maybe larger animals. The other thing to consider is that, as you can see in this picture on the left, they will push out their feed fairly quickly. Within about the first hour, they will be out of reachable feed. So you need to come back within an hour after feeding to then push that feed up so they have access to it. If you don't do that, you kind of start to have problems with hoof wearing and longer toes on the inside of these feet. As you can see here on the right, that animal pushes and tries to lunge forward to reach that feed, and that will cause significant hoof problems. So you do have to manage these limit-fed diets. You have to keep that in mind. Also, you have to be adjusting feed amounts on a regular basis. So it takes some additional work with your nutritionist to be able to do this, but it's definitely doable. Many farms use this as a way to control feed intake and growth of heifers. So I guess with that, if there's any questions, I will try to address those. Otherwise, I can let Tina take over the rest of the presentation.
So you do have some questions, Matt.
Oh, good.
So first, just to mention, Amanda shared with everyone, there's a link for the growth chart that Matt showed that goes back to our extension website. And the second question, how does limit feeding affect rumen pH and fluctuations?
That's good. And I can't remember the exact, I know that Pat Hoffman had looked at that, and I know they've looked at it at Penn State, but I can't say remember exactly the results from that study.
So
sorry, I can't answer that exactly, but
okay.
But I can say that when they did do measurements of the rumens, the actual size of the rumens during limit feeding and then before lactation. So when they were adjusting to the lactating cow diets, and they did see differences in rumen size or rumen volume, I guess, during the limit feeding phase. But during the lactation phase, those differences were gone. Then they then readjusted to those lactating cow diets. So there wasn't a carryover effect of limit feeding into lactation, at least in the rumen size and the volume. So I can't remember exactly the pH or the fermentation side though.
Okay. So you mentioned it briefly. Do you do a body condition score on most of these heifers and you're doing weight as well?
Yeah, generally, yeah, the larger ones, the post-breeding ones, we generally do. Yeah. So that's a very, very important point, is that body condition scoring is very important to do, to make sure we're putting the correct growth on these animals. We don't want to be putting condition on. We want to be putting lean muscle and skeletal growth on these animals instead of fat deposition, especially post-breeding. So body condition scoring really can be helpful with that.
So I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Tina Coleman, and her title is Developing the Calf from the Inside Out. And Tina has been with the UW Extension since 1999. Since 2012, she's been in Fond du Lac County as dairy and livestock agent. Her proactive outreach includes programming efforts utilizing university-based research to help producers adopt to improve management practices on the farm to increase animal productivity and welfare. She's conducted on-farm and field surveys and research related to heifer management, and has published articles and has curricula developed regarding those topics. She's been a leader in statewide educational efforts regarding dairy replacements and dairy workers training. And one of those is the award-winning UW Extension Dairy Workers Training Calf Management Skills, which we're pretty proud of that material. So with that, I see Tina's got her screen up. And Tina, do you want to take over and talk about developing the calf from the inside out?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction. And as you saw, Matt Aikens just talked about developing the heifer for maturity after post-weaning, but we're going to talk about a very important aspect of preparing the calf pre-weaning. So we're going to talk about developing that calf from the inside out, and really we're going to just hone in on the rumen development of that calf. And rumen development is very important. It's probably the most important aspect of raising that young newborn calf, second only to the use of colostrum and getting that immune function going. Developing that rumen is key because we are actually taking that newborn calf and developing their gastrointestinal tract to be able to function as a rumen. The rumen development is so important because later we will need that rumen to help promote feed intake, which will translate when she's older into growth as well as milk production. And then also we need that rumen for nutrient digestibility and absorption. Our nature did a wonderful thing in creating the cow, and the fact that she could take forages that we as monogastrics can't take and translate that into a nutrient, microbial protein, which then later goes into making milk. And microbial protein is probably the best, highest quality protein that we can possibly give that animal. And therefore, developing that rumen is key in making sure that we can make that microbial protein and then be able to translate that into milk production as well as into meat production. So when we're going to talk about rumen development, we're going to first just focus a little bit on anatomy. And when we look at the digestive system, that calf has a 4-compartment stomach, just like an adult cow does as well, but it looks very different than it would 2 years later. Her rumen is only about 30% of the total volume of the stomach area as compared to 85% of the stomach area in an adult cow. For that newborn calf, the true stomach, or the abomasum, comprises the largest part of the stomach area, and that's where the digestion occurs. And as we develop that rumen, we kind of switch it over where the rumen becomes the main digestive factory for the cow. So the pre-remnant phase, again, this is a calf from about 0 to 3 weeks of age, and at this point, she has a non-functional rumen. Her abomasum is the main compartment of her stomach that is functioning and makes her function more like a monogastric animal, like you or I or pigs, the simple stomached animals, where we have acid digestion. And at this time, its milk is the main feed ingredient that is digested by the abomasum. And the longer that we do not offer dry feed, the longer it takes for that rumen to develop. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. So these are images from Dr. Judd Hendricks out of Penn State. And really, what's really key is developing that rumen lining. And we've heard of rumen papillae. And if you look at the image on the left, we could see an undeveloped rumen lining. So there along the, held up by the hand, we see it's very smooth and the surface area is not as great. And then if we look to the image on the right, we could see here where it's a developed rumen lining that we start seeing these papillae, these projections sticking out, giving us more surface area for absorption of nutrients. And this papillae, this rumen development, allows that calf to be able to digest and absorb nutrients later on in life. And when we get to the cow, we really want to develop that rumen so that we really have this nice, beautiful, I call it a carpet, but finger-like projections of papillae that we allow us to absorb those nutrients once it's digested in the rumen. We also have, a reticulum as well as the omasum. And then again, we still have the abomasum or the simple stomach or true stomach of the animal. But this is where we're focusing on today. And as caretakers of our pre-weaned calves, this is our goal, is to have this rumen lining development so that we can switch it from a non-functioning ruminant to a functioning ruminant. So that process, when it comes to rumen development, really has 5 key ingredients. It's the starch, or the grain, the starter. It's liquid from water, bacteria, muscular movement of the rumen, and the absorptive ability for the rumen lining. Now, again, when we think about the inside of the digestive system of the newborn calf, as we see here that this is the lining of the true stomach or the abomasum. It's very smooth. This is acid digestion that occurs here, just like you or I. And when we feed a liquid feed or milk to that calf, it comes down the esophagus and then bypasses the rumen area, bypasses via the esophageal groove directly into the abomasum. And this is where the liquid feed then is digested and then later absorbed for energy, and is the main energy supplier for the calf until that rumen is developed. And as we develop that digestive system of that calf, that occurs about the first 4 to 8 weeks of life. And as you can see, 4 to 8 weeks of life really coincides with the time we typically wean her off of liquid feed. One of the key things we want to remember about developing the digestive system, that it's a chemical process. It's not a physical process. We actually have some chemistry in line that really causes the change that we want to occur in the rumen lining. And just mentioned earlier, the energy and protein needs of that newborn calf or the pre-weaned calf is derived from the intestinal digestion of the liquid feed or the milk. And once we start giving that calf water and starter and they begin consuming it, we really start initiating that rumen development. So it's really key to start giving starter within the first couple of days of life. Here's another image out of Penn State looking at the rumen lining. And again, if we look at A and B, that's the rumen lining of a calf that has not had any grain. The first one is with a milk-only diet, and then B is a milk and hay diet. And then when we look at C, we have a starter diet with milk and hay. And as you can see, it's really the starter, the starch, the carbohydrates, and then again, the byproducts of fermentation of those byproducts or the digestion of those products that really help that rumen development, and it's a chemical process. It's not the scratch factor as people once believed from the hay. It's actually the chemical process and absorption of some major nutrients. So when we look at the digestive system, we're really looking at the transition phase from 4 to 8 weeks of age. So 0 to 3 weeks of age, they really don't have a functioning rumen. And as we introduce starter and water and eventually bacteria, then we start seeing changes in the rumen lining. And hopefully that our rumen becomes the main digestion site and begins growing in size in proportion to the abomasum. And at this time, we want to see the growth of papillae and the rumen lining that will eventually help it be able to digest and absorb many of the nutrients that are produced from the digestion in the rumen. And this really occurs from starch, from the breakdown of the starch grain into the volatile fatty acids of butyrate, propionate, and acetate. So again, the availability of feedstuff is key in initiating rumen development. We want to offer clean, fresh calf starter about day 3. And when we offer fresh calf starter, initially, we don't want to give it a whole bucket because that would be wasteful, but giving it a handful or a couple of handfuls and then gradually building that up so that we can introduce the calf starter to the calf and they'll start nibbling. So any little bit of starter that we can get into the calf will help initiate rumen development, where then they'll start intaking more. We want to make sure that our starter meets the NRC recommendations, and as with any creature, even us, palatability is key for the consumption or starter. Now, again, what about hay? And when we talked a little bit about the acetate, propionate, and butyrate, which are volatile fatty acids from the digestion of starter, the digestion of hay provides acetic acid or acetate. And this acetic acid is less crucial for rumen development. And we can see here on images again from Penn State University on the left that looking at the rumen, which is on the right side of the picture, a calf at 4 weeks of age fed milk, grain, and hay has more projections or papillae development than the calf at the same age that was only fed milk and hay. So again, it's not necessarily the scratch factor that hay provides to promote healthy growth of papillae. It's acetate, volatile fatty acid, but again, the acetate does not provide enough energy for the rumen development. So when we look at hay, this is why we want to offer it after weaning to give time for that rumen papillae to develop into where we can be able to digest hay, ferment it, digest it, and absorb those nutrients. And we know this is chemical and not a physical process. So research here shown Jim Quigley out of Calf Notes in 1999 looked at the different types of materials or metabolites that can be used to promote rumen development. And he showed that it's stimulated by volatile fatty acids, the butyrate, the propionate, the byproducts of grain digestion. It is not the scratch factors people once years ago believed. And when we look at the chart, we could see that milk's development on the rumen provides some. The volatile fatty acids, mainly butyrate and propionate, are key, the material that provides rumen development. Grain, obviously, when we digest grain, butyrate and propionate are some of the end products and will help promote rumen development. When we digest hay, acetate is the main volatile fatty acid produced from that digestion. So we see that propionate and butyrate are higher on rumen development, and therefore we want to make sure we have grain versus hay. When we put in other types of particles or sponges to help give the scratch factor, really there was no impact on rumen development. So when we look at this, it's really about our volatile fatty acids, the end products of grain or starch digestion. And another image to show you here, this is a calf, a veal calf that we provided the stomach from, the 4-compartment stomach. And as we can see here in the lower part of the slide on the left, this is the rumen, and then the size of it in proximity to the abomasum, the reticulum, and the omasum. We could see that, it does have a large amount of volume compared to the other 3 compartments. And then we could see that mainly it's a milk digestion here that we see in the rumen that eventually bypassed the stomach, but actually went into the rumen. And then when we look at this later on, we'll see a couple more slides here. As compared to a calf the same age on a grain diet, and we could see that there's some hay in here as well, we could see that the rumen is substantially larger than the other 3 compartments of the stomach. This is because we're expanding, we're growing that, giving it some depth. And then you could see, looking on the inside of this rumen, that we could see here, not very well, but we could see that there's some projection, like finger-like projections here compared to the all milk diet calf. So liquid in the rumen is one of the key things we need to have, and it's really liquid from water, because a lot of times that milk bypasses the rumen and goes straight into the abomasum due to the esophageal groove. Now, a little milk will flow over to the rumen, which is great, but really water is the main source because that goes directly into the rumen. And we want to be offering water shortly after birth, because we see here, based on Kurtz in 1984, that we increase some weight gains. Calves that had free choice water had 0.6 pounds per gain per day versus no water at 0.4 pounds per gain per day. We actually increased starter intake, which is huge because starter is really the key ingredient into rumen development. And then we also saw less days of scours on those animals. 2000, Jim Quigley shows that the water intake versus starter consumption, as we increase the amount of water to our calves, that the starter intake actually increases in proportion. So key again is to help promote that starter intake. We want to have accessible, clean, fresh water. And why do we need to have this water in the rumen? It provides that wonderful environment for rapid bacterial growth. Milk does not provide enough liquid because it bypasses the rumen and goes into the abomasum. However, even small amounts will help promote bacterial growth in the rumen. But again, that major source of liquid in the rumen for rumen development is actually from water. Now, when we have our starch in there and we have our water to digest these feeds, we really need to have bacteria in the rumen. And at birth, it is non-existent in the rumen. And as caretakers and as nature, it's our role to provide that bacteria. And really that bacteria is introduced in the rumen at the time that calf starts to consume calf starter or starts nibbling and suckling on other things in its environment, ingesting some of that bacteria, that good bacteria from its environment. And we need that bacteria because it helps with the digestion process, and again, helps with the end products that causes the changes in the rumen lining. So it's really key to have bacteria here, and then eventually this bacteria will be then harvested, if you want to use that word, or metabolized by actually the rumen to be microbial protein once she begins older and becomes a functioning rumen. And when we look at bacteria fermentation, again, going back over the volatile fatty acids, that's what we really need from all of this, from the process, is that volatile fatty acid, which comes from bacteria digesting the feed in the rumen. And again, acetate becomes from fiber sources. Butyrate and propionate, the two key volatile fatty acids we need, are from starch and sugar sources. So again, our starter, that will be key in helping create those volatile fatty acids for rumen development. And again, when we look at this rumen development, we're going to have this starch, this grain that's ingested and is in the rumen. And as bacteria begins to digest this starch, we have end products of propionate, butyrate, and acetate. And it is through the absorption of these three volatile fatty acids, or VFAs, more so with butyrate, that we see and start that change of that rumen lining to the papillae, having the rumen lining being from smooth and developing slowly over time to finger-like projections or papillae to give it more surface area and be able to absorb more nutrients. And as the rumen changes and it develops more of a lining, we become a functional rumen, the abomasum no longer becomes the main source of energy absorption. The energy source will eventually take over by the rumen and then absorbed into the bloodstream of the animal. And developing this rumen really is about helping that animal be able to digest forages, fiber, feed products that we as monogastrics cannot digest, and turning it into a product that we can, such as milk or meat. So again, looking at the papillae, which one would you prefer? Would you want the heads, which is on the left, or the tails, which is on the right? Again, if you recall those two images I showed you of a calf fed a all milk diet or veal calf versus a grain diet, we could see that these are the rumen linings from those two animals. And we could see here again, this is kind of what we want to have. This is, I call it kind of like a little carpet, a lot of finger-like projections, increases the surface area to allow for absorption of those metabolites, a lot of that energy and the nutrients that we need. Here, there's not much. You could see some development starting of finger-like projections, but really for the most part, pretty smooth. Doesn't provide the surface area we need. This seems a lot healthier looking in color. Can't explain that, but these calves are both the same age. One was a veal calf versus one was our traditional dairy calf diets. Another key thing when we talk about rumen development is we need some muscular movement. And when we have muscular movement, just like we do in the milk cow, that rumen, the muscles are churning over the feed, mixing the liquid, the starch, the bacteria, so that we can have that digestion occur. And also we need that muscular movement to help move feed stuff through the gastrointestinal tract further down through the small intestine. Now we have several types of movement. We have rumen pressure pushing on the feed, rumen contractions, as well as cud chewing, which helps with movement, swirling, mixing that feed. Now, at the time of birth, because again, we don't really have a functional rumen, there's really little activity in that rumen at the time. And again, as we slowly develop that rumen lining and those muscles start growing, then we really start building that muscular movement. And as feed intake increases, so do those contractions in the rumen. We need absorption as well. So we're really doing a lot to this animal in a very short amount of time. And when we think about the layers of the rumen, there's two layers. One is muscular, which helps with the contractions, the mixing of the feed with the liquid and the bacteria, as well as moving it down the GI tract. But we also have an epithelial layer, which does the absorption of the nutrients. So at birth, just like with the muscular layer, that there's no muscular movement or contractions at time of birth, the epithelial layer really doesn't have the ability to absorb nutrients yet. The volatile fatty acids, the butyrate and the propionate that are created from the digestion of the starter, stimulates that growth, which then elongates those finger-like projections, those papillae, so that we can start having more surface area and more nutrients absorbed. When we don't have proper rumen development, we do put some nutritional stress on our calves. It's more difficult to wean them. We could see at least a month slowdown in growth for those calves, a month behind because of the lack of rumen development and getting them off of liquid feed. And then obviously with nutritional stress, we can possibly see some immune function decreases as well. And with that improper rumen development, it becomes more costly to raise this calf because the liquid feed is more costly than our starter for many individuals who are still using milk replacer. And when we think about improper rumen development or limited rumen development, one of the things we want to just touch briefly on is acidosis. Now, calf acidosis is not the same as a cow acidosis, and defined by some students with Dr. Judd Hendricks in 2016. Calf acidosis, some of those signs include being lethargic, anorexic, having some abdominal discomfort, or maybe they're kicking at their sides, and lack of rumen motility. And a lot of those, the rumen motility, really coincides with rumen development. And we can see this calf acidosis in cows 4 to 6 hours post-feeding. And why do we see that? What happens in the calf if the rumen isn't developed properly and we give that calf a lot of grain, what happens is that starch, the calf consumes a lot of that feed. And then it digests it. We have a lot of butyrate and a lot of propionate floating here in the rumen. And if that rumen is not properly developed where it can absorb all of that volatile fatty acids through the lining, we have a buildup of the acid, a low decrease in pH, a buildup of these two acids or potentially 3 acids. So therefore, they become discomfort, and that happens 4 to 6 hours. So not walkthroughs just every 12 hours, but observing your calves, looking for signs of discomfort can help give you an idea if we have good rumen development or not. Because if they can't absorb when they're older calves, when they look like they should be consuming large amounts of grain because they are larger, if that rumen isn't developed or on track, they're going to have a buildup of these acids, which then causes the acidosis. Judd Hendricks had mentioned that if we have issues of acidosis due to the grain, even feeding high quality forages to kind of reduce the amount of those particular acids and more acetate would be key as well. So when we think about weaning calves, being mindful of rumen development, really it's intake base. And we want to have calves taking in grain starting as early as 3 days of age, even if it's a handful of grain, to help initiate and start that rumen development. Because by the time we wean her in 8 weeks, we want her to have a functioning rumen so that we can wean her off of milk, and most of her energy and dietary needs are being absorbed through the rumen. We want substantial grain intake by 3 weeks of age, at least half a pound of feed grain per day. And then by the time we wean her, we want at least 1 pound of grain per day or more, 21 to 28 days leading up to weaning. And again, thinking about the acidosis, we talk about 2 to 3 pounds of grain per day for 2 to 3 days consistently when we wean. That seemed to be the magic number. But they can still consume 2 to 3 pounds of grain per day when they're older animals with a larger stomach, that we may have problems with acidosis or other issues because we're not fully developing the rumen. So making sure they're intaking grain 3 to 4 weeks before weaning is key, because we want to make sure that rumen papillae is developed, elongated, can absorb those nutrients, and we don't have a buildup of some of those volatile fatty acids. And then finally, when we wean them, again, intake based, they're eating enough grain and starter so that most of their energy needs are coming from that and not the liquid feed. We want to gradually wean them off of milk, 5 to 7 days, step down, so that it's not abrupt and causing some weaning stress. So again, I went through that very quickly with rumen development, but the most important aspect of raising a dairy calf behind colostrum management, making sure we develop that immune system, is really developing that rumen. Without developing that rumen, it increased our costs in the fact that we're feeding more liquid milk or liquid feed instead of starter. We really don't have a solid foundation for this animal to start intaking forages. And then we see some slow in growth, which then kind of impacts the heifer maturity that Matt has spoke to previously. And that, we have later days at first breeding, which then translate to later days at first calving, meaning we don't see income from her until after, or potentially delayed, because that we're not providing a solid foundation. So again, that was just quickly about developing the calf from the inside out, looking at that rumen development. And the key takeaways is, again, that it is very important getting the starter in the calf to have volatile fatty acids from grain digestion to help the lining of that rumen develop those finger-like papillae projections, so that eventually when she is weaned, she can start consuming forages and be able to be a productive member in the herd.
So Tina, I got a couple questions for you, and a reminder to the audience that if you did have questions, you could use the chat to put them in. I was wondering if you could explain how, since they're both liquids, how does the milk or milk replacer end up in the abomasum and the water goes to the rumen? How does that happen?
So the esophageal groove is that groove in the esophagus that kind of is a flap that bypasses feed to the rumen or to the abomasum. And from what I understand, that is really kind of triggered by the temperature of the milk. So we tend to feed milk at the temperature of the calf's body temperature. Water is typically fed basically straight out of the well, whatever temperature that would be, which just tends to be cooler. We do like to promote warmer water fed in the wintertime, just so that we don't decrease the body temperature of the calf and that she's allowed to help herself stay warm in those cold months. But it's really the temperature, from what I understand, that kind of triggers that esophageal groove to open or close to bypass that warm milk into the abomasum. Now, some of that milk can trickle into the rumen for whatever various reasons, but that's good to have some of that there, but there's just not enough of that milk in the rumen to really promote rumen development and the bacteria and the digestion of the starter. So that's why we provide water. And that's why also, because that esophageal groove and the mechanism of how it works, that milk bypasses into the abomasum to be digested.
Okay. And I saw in your great pictures, I'd call it a texturized calf starter. You talked about palatability. Is that the only kind of calf starter to use, or could we use all pellets or something ground, or what's your opinion on that?
Well, most of it's pelleted or texturized. I guess I don't know if I have an opinion. Maybe even Matt, being more of a nutritionist, could help us with that. But palatability is huge. And then when you get a lot of fines in some of these grains, or it's dusty or clumpy, it tends not to be consumed as well. So I think key is use whatever works for you that meets NRC requirements that the calf will consume in a timely manner, as well as not kind of sort through it and then be able to consume those nutrients and then hopefully develop that rumen.